chapter 27, section 4. It's called The Other America. And so amidst the prosperity of the 1950s, we have to remember that the Great Depression did not end for everyone. Millions of Americans were still living in poverty. One example I want to give you is white flight, the difference between suburban life and urban life. By 1962, the poverty level was down. So think about this. Prior to the stock market crash, we were at about 70% poverty level. By 62, that number had dropped to 25%. But that's still a huge number. 1 out of 4 Americans in 1962 could not afford the basic necessities for a comfortable life for their families. And this was affecting minorities to a higher degree than it was white Americans. And so that's the term white flight, that many prosperous Americans were leaving the cities, and many of the low-income neighborhoods were in the inner city. And so what does this mean? So this means that the inner cities have very low tax revenue, very low social services, very little money for their schools, for their public facilities. And so, many cities can't afford to keep schools open. They can't afford to provide public transportation, and much less police or fire. And so poverty in the inner cities begins to grow rapidly. And these poor economic conditions lead to illness, often due to malnutrition or terrible living conditions because of the inability to fix this. Now, a lot of cities post-World War II to the present have been engaged in urban renewal projects, that is, replacing rundown buildings with new federally subsidized low-income housing. With the Department of Housing and Urban Development, this department was created to improve conditions in inner cities, to provide funding for low-income housing. Even Hendersonville has federally subsidized low-income housing through the Housing and Urban Development Department. But here's the problem with that. There's not enough. There's not enough. And so maybe you qualify for that if your family's below a certain income level. Maybe there's room, maybe there's not. Maybe your family makes too much to qualify for low-income housing, but not enough to actually pay for housing yourself. You fall into that gap. And so there's just not enough to go around. And like I said, many of these things are affecting minorities to a higher degree. So in the Southwest, states like Arizona, New Mexico, and even Texas and California, many of the people living in these places are first or second generation immigrants from Mexico. And throughout the years of the war, there was a program called the Bracero Program, which was encouraging migration of Latinos to the United States, to develop the Southwest, to populate the Southwest, to work. And the program was set to expire in 1947, meaning that these people were invited to the United States to work, to live, to develop these industries and cities and towns. But then they were expected to leave after 5 years. And so you're telling me that people who are coming here to start over and to begin families and to work and develop careers are now called illegal aliens. So invited when we needed them, and then we were expected to kick people to the curb. There was an incident called the Longoria incident, where a Latino veteran of the Second World War, Felix Longoria, had passed away. And the funeral home in his town refused to serve this man, refused to provide services. In fact, it led to a union of Mexican-American veterans. Remember, 300,000 Mexican-Americans fought in the Second World War. And then going back to a country that in some cases refused to bury their dead, in some cases expected them to leave. Okay, go fight for the war and then leave? Are you kidding me? And so they organized and began the Unity League of California, beginning a voter registration drive. excuse me, to register Latino voters. And you know what? That program began in the 1950s. And by 2012, the Latino vote influenced a presidential election for the first time. That's how long it can take to actually see political action come to fruition. But it works. In a democracy, political action works, but it can take a very long time. I don't know if you know this, but Native Americans are among the poorest people in the United States. The U.S. policy toward Native Americans during the Great Depression was in favor of autonomy, mainly because we didn't want to have to provide public services for Native American communities. From the Great Depression forward, the United States has implemented a termination policy, which means to cut off economic support to Native American communities. You know, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was focused mainly on urbanization, on taking Native Americans off of their reservations and relocating them in cities. It proved to be a colossal failure. You know, so here we have a social experiment. What happens if we take the poorest, most vulnerable people and say, bootstraps, you got this, pull yourself up? What happens? You ever wondered? Hey, gee, I wonder what happens if we make these people do what they can on their own. It's a colossal failure. You can't take a group of people that have been historically marginalized, that have been discriminated against and abused and looked down upon, and then say, cool, you're ready for the world. Good luck. The program was abandoned in 1963.